Thanks to everybody for joining us here today. My name is Joshua Tucker. I'm a professor here in the politics department and also the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia. And first of all, I want to welcome Tomila, but Arturas is going to introduce her. But I just want to tell for everyone who's logged on through the Jordan Center that this is one of the events that we do a few times a year where we have joint sessions of the Jordan Center and the Comparative Politics seminar in the politics department. So for those of you who are used to Jordan Center talks where we tend to have speakers who will speak and then take questions at the end, I just want to give you a heads up that the style in the seminar, it can be a little different with people asking questions during the course of the presentation. So people should feel free to raise their hands during the presentation using the Zoom feature. It's not a webinar setup, so we can just call on people to ask questions. And Arturas, do we have a discussant assigned for this?
No, we do not. We do not have discussants this year.
Okay, so we don't have a discussant. So otherwise, you should just feel free. That won't be different. So I just wanted to give people a heads up because I know in the past this has led to some cultural differences across the two as we unify them. But anyway, so this is serving a joint function of the Comparative Politics seminar in the politics department and a regular Jordan Center event. So without further ado, Tomila, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to see all of you here today. And I'm going to turn it over to Arturas to introduce our speaker.
All right, thank you, Josh. Again, thanks to the Jordan Center for helping us to co-organize this particular event. So my name is Arturas Rozenas. I'm an associate professor here at NYU Politics Department, and I'm one of the co-organizers of the Comparative Politics workshop. So my introduction will be very brief. We are very thrilled and happy to welcome Tomila Lankina here to give us a talk. Tomila is a professor of international relations at LSE, and she has a prolific portfolio of articles on Russia, on especially protest mobilization in Russia. And today she's going to give us a book talk. This is a bit unusual format for the politics department as well. So this is going to be a presentation of a book that just came out 2 years ago, I believe, on the state origins of democracy in Russia. So Tomila, we have 1 hour and 45 minutes. And as Josh mentioned, there might be interruptions and clarification questions as we go along.
Thank you very much, Arturas and Josh, for a very generous introduction and for incorporating this unusual format of a book talk. And let me preface by saying that I'm excited to be speaking at NYU, the Politics Department of the Jordan Center, because the work that some of the colleagues here, Josh and Arturas, have done that well precedes this book that I've published about a year ago, has been a great inspiration and really in very important ways informed my own research into the historical legacies of social structure and how they affect democratic variations in Russian regions and in general democratic pathway of Russia and other post-communist states. So I wanted to start this talk by pointing out this picture in the background of a very wealthy, opulent merchant family in the Samara city on the Volga. And this is from an archive of this family that I serendipitously discovered when I was doing my research. When we look at images like this, and this is from the early 1900s, we think of a world that has disappeared. And that is very important because we don't think about the possible significance of the bourgeoisie, which, as we know, has featured very prominently in a lot of discussions about countries' democratic pathways. We don't think about the bourgeoisie as something that has survived in Russia through the communist period. But actually in this talk, I'm not going to just discuss the survival of this elements of the middle class or the proto-bourgeoisie from the Tsarist period to the present, but also try to make sense of how the social divisions of the Tsarist period continue to inform Russian politics now and how they continue to divide citizens. And again, here I'm presenting two images. On the left, we see these people chanting pro-Putin slogans. We think of this as the kind of the majority or the mass of citizens, and a small minority on the right. This is from the trendy opposition news outlet TV Rain that has been closed in Russia and branded as foreign agent and is now broadcasting from from abroad, from Amsterdam. So these kinds of social divisions between a very, very small intelligentsia or the kind of middle class and a large mass of citizens who we think are Putin supporters and certainly contributing the bulk of support for the war and for the autocratic regime, that is something that I link in my book to the past social structure of Russia. And these divisions, the chasm between the so-called common folk, the narod, and the small intelligentsia or the bourgeoisie, small middle class in the Tsarist period, which has been described or discussed very much on the eve of the revolution as something that spurred the Bolshevik Revolution in the first place, that has survived the communist project, these kind of social divisions. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is very controversial. Those of you who are familiar with the literature on communist, on historical legacies of communism know that a lot of that literature is about the kind of the destruction of the old social order. So one has to present the evidence very, very carefully to make a claim that essentially debunks these established paradigms about the communist state building paradigm as something that had a shattering effect on society. So I do that in the book, which very carefully traces the causal mechanisms using a lot of historical, qualitative, archival, and other materials, as well as data. And for those of you who are especially keen to kind of question or ask further questions about the data aspect of the analysis, I do have a paper out in the American Political Science Review with my co-author Alexandra Liebman, who is behind a lot of the data analysis, and really there's a massive, massive data appendix. So you're welcome to consult the APSR paper if you do want to get more about the nitty-gritty of how we establish this connection between the historical sort of social divisions and social structure in Tsarist Russia, how it survived through communism and into the present, and what implications it has for democracy and development in the present. I also have sort of more soundbitey kind of things in my book website that I created to promote my book, but also a Broad Street blog post I wrote. If those of you who are not familiar, it's a new historical political economy group of scholars who are running it, and there's a lot of interesting work that's being featured on this in this blog series. So I also contributed something that's quite short and gives you a nutshell of the research findings. So let's step back a little bit and discuss how is it that that this paradigm of communism as a great new dawn that shattered and destroyed the order of the past. How did it come about? Well, I pin it to three major factors. One is, of course, the significance of Soviet propaganda itself, something like the present day fake news that we're familiar with. The Soviets, the Bolsheviks were very, very instrumental in fabricating these images of the Soviet state as something new and kind of really magnifying their achievements. The second factor is Western left-leaning intellectuals. Again, it has significant parallels now with the kind of pro-Putin various sort of influential intellectuals making positive noises about the Russian autocracy. But in the 1930s, we had people like on this photograph of Sydney and Beatrice Webb, who are co-founders of my institution, LIC, who were prominent Fabian socialists. They went to the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Stalin and his henchmen showed them around, and they came back and wrote a very kind of influential but also preposterous book on Soviet communism, A New Civilization, which appeared with a question mark in an early edition, and the subsequent editions appeared in the affirmative. And most recently, we have narratives by prominent economists like Thomas Piketty that when they do describe the revolutions, wars, and their effects on society and social structure, they look at these effects in purely economistic monetary terms. They don't pay enough attention, in my view, to kind of the intangible capital, social capital, human capital, cultural values, etc., that people like Josh and Arturas have in their work very much also emphasized. That is something that can withstand even the most shattering kind of state building projects. So in my book, I dig in, dip into a lot of historiography to see where these narratives originated and try to kind of debunk them. So at the root of my analysis is the social structure and of Tsarist Russia, and specifically the institution of estate. In Russian, it is called soslovia, and very few people are familiar with it, although historians of Imperial Russia are beginning to draw attention to this as an important institution, something that we should really pay attention to when it comes to structuring property rights, access to education, and all kinds of other rights, but also kind of the big divides between the what I call the educated estates of, if you look at this graph, this triangular sort of diagram that I present, at the very top we have the nobility. So Russian estate system divided a society into the noble estate, including hereditary and personal, tiny proportion of the population, only 1.5%. The clergy, even less than that, less than 1%. And then there's this mysterious group of Mishani, which is actually the second largest group after peasants, but we don't really know very much about it. In my book, I conceptualize these three boxes up: nobility, clergy, and Mishani, as well as merchants, which is even a tinier group of citizens, less than 1%, as the educated estates. And it is these estates that I argue have contributed to the development of the Soviet middle class. And there is a kind of intergenerational structure of reproduction of values and education and professional capital that shapes social divisions now. And at the very bottom, of course, we have the social ladder. We see the peasantry, almost 80% of the population. And I will show you some statistics illustrating the vast educational gulf between these various groups, educated estates and the vast majority of peasantry. So in my book, I conceptualize these educated estates as a proto-middle class, proto-bourgeoisie that was already rapidly professionalizing on the eve of, even before the revolution. And these groups are kind of important in my story of how the middle class and bourgeoisie in Russia originated and why it matters for democracy now. But it's not just about social inequalities, it's not just the social inequalities and divisions that I highlight. I also look at the public sphere, the extent to which some of these best educated and most privileged groups, especially the nobles and merchants, with a sprinkling of Mishani, were extremely well connected and networked in the public sphere. And in Russia, in Tsarist Russia, the public sphere included the gymnasium, for instance, the high schools, private fee-paying elite high schools, the professional associations, zemstva, that is local government bodies, as well as different other local associations, etc. And I draw this information from my main case studies, the region on the Volga, Samara region and Samara city. So on this image here, you see a photograph of some of these activists in the public sphere who founded schools that became influential in various civic initiatives, but also these were extremely insular and in some ways not exclusionary, but certainly this public sphere was mostly involved merchants and the nobility. So very, very small slice of Imperial Russian society. On this diagram here on the right, we see at the bottom the social ladder, kind of crude representation of peasants at the bottom, Mishani, clergy, and aristocracy, then the kind of public sphere, which is this layer of different professional groups and how these different estates were represented there. And at the very top, we see the state institutions that most scholars, historians, and political scientists usually focus on when they talk about the destruction of the old order. Indeed, we know that the monarchy was deposed, and the Bolsheviks went after the coercive institutions of the czars, the police, the army, etc., decimating them. But what about this intermediate layer of the public sphere? What about schools? What about the professions? In the literature on the bourgeoisie and the role it plays in development leading to democratic outcomes, these are the kind of institutions that we usually focus on. But in Tsarist Russia, And in the communist period, we think of these kind of intermediate layers, something that has disappeared. So
Tomila,
again,
just a second. Tomila, Josh has a
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, can I ask a question just to go back to the previous slide?
Mhm.
So I just wanted to get a little more of a sense of what you mean by this concept of public sphere, because even, you know, from knowledge of Russia, but also just from like your graphic, right? This public sphere, I'm assuming you're saying, is sort of walled off from the vast majority of the population. So normally when we think of like public versus private education, we think of public education as something that's available to everyone. Whereas in this context, I don't think you're using it in that regard. So does the public refer to the source of funding? Does it refer to the extent to which there is state control or not state control? So could you just explain a little bit more in this context of this highly hierarchical society, where what do you mean by a public sphere that's only available to a small portion of the population?
Sure, great question. So what I mean is that these individuals who were associated, for instance, with the private gymnasiums, educational institutions, or the local government body. So there were, aside from the Zemstva, there were elected, local councils in urban settings. These individuals were not just narrowly involved in their professional work as teachers or as local councillors. They actually met and interacted to discuss issues of public concern, how to open schools for the deaf and the blind and the poor children who cannot pay school fees, right? How to build the new museum, who should we ask? Like, they were fundraising, and some of them were quite political, like this woman in the middle of the photograph, Antonina Hardina. She founded a private gymnasium, but her gymnasium was considered also quite left-wing, and she would harbor kind of left-wing activist pupils and shelter them from authorities. So these were kind of politicized individuals who also wanted to better the lot of ordinary folks. So they were not just pursuing private, narrowly professional concerns, but the concerns of the kind of the betterment of society. And in that sense, it's also kind of a classic Habermasian public sphere. And if you look at literature and public sphere in Western European countries at the time, it was also quite elite in its makeup. It wasn't made up of the peasantry or the factory workers. So in that sense, I see kind of parallels. I don't know if does that sort of answer your question? Just great, thank you. So and partly also linking to Josh's question is this. What I will say about this next slide, here's a kind of funky diagram based on social network analysis that I was able to perform thanks to one of my brilliant PhD students who kind of helped me set up these graphs and data. So again, this is based on the city of Samara. There are so-called address calendars that Imperial Russian produced for almost every region, or gubernia as they were called at the time. This is data from 1916, that is 1 year before the Bolshevik Revolution. So on the eve of the revolution, I tried to see how the society and this public sphere looked like, to what extent were different citizens connected. And I'll explain why this connectedness is important. In my book, I use kind of Granovetter's and other insights from other social network analysis about how individuals can survive and reproduce their status professionally and in a social sense. And so I trace these networks to the post-revolutionary settings. But we see on this graph, those of you who have done social network analysis would recognize that if you look at the circles that are very tight and do not have any kind of extensions to other circle, that means this is an organization or a group that is not very well connected to other arenas. And but on the other hand, if we look at the pink graph, circle at the top, that is one of the gymnasiums, you see that there are lots of links from this circle or node or circle to the other organizations and institutions. So this is based, and I did analysis using both organizations and individuals as nodes. So this graph shows us that some organizations, like the management of Tashkent railways, for instance, or the police authorities are not very well connected at all across the different arenas of professional life, but some are extremely well connected. And this shows you, this kind of illustrates the public sphere, and that people who are teachers in gymnasium are also running the Red Cross Society or the Botanical Society or the, not all of them are here, but just as an illustration, or are sitting in the local council bodies, and they're all debating important causes of the day. The fact that they're connected means that individuals in these different arenas know each other very well, intimately. In fact, there is also a lot of intermarriages, etc., etc. So that story of networkedness is also very important for survival after the revolution, including for the height of Stalinist repressions. Right? We know from the new literature on Stalinist repressions and on violence that actually communities bond and band together when they face violence, although that's kind of not uncontested, but certainly some research suggests that. How else can we actually also establish the causal mechanisms linking the social structure of the past to the present through the dark decades of communism? So I was able to find, completely by chance, a really, really rich and amazing archive of this family of merchants on the Volga region. You see these pictures on the left. This is from one of the individuals in this family, Konstantin Neklutin, who with his wife and infant son fled the Bolshevik Revolution to America. And the reason why we have this archive preserved is because the members of his family who stayed in Soviet Russia and Soviet Samara was sending letters to him in America. So he preserved those letters, and they survive for posterity to tell us, give us an insight into the kind of microdynamics of the household economies. So there's the economic dimension. How did people feed themselves, right? When they were this merchant family that was persecuted by the Bolsheviks, that is the bourgeoisie. And how did they transform themselves from merchant industrialists into the Soviet middle class? So I point an arrow to on the right, you see a picture of the matriarch, the mother of Constantine, who had many children, like almost 10 children, I believe. Some of them were decimated in the Civil War, but others stayed on and survived in Soviet Samara, including Anastasia. So I will come back to her. She's an important part of the story. We also have lots of Russians opening up their family closets, literally. We know that those of us who are from the Soviet Union, that it was unsafe to speak of your bourgeois past or a clergy past or aristocratic. So a lot of people kept kind of things stashed away. But after the fall of communism, people exhibited this very active curiosity about their family origins before the revolution. And we now know much more about the people who I believe have been completely neglected and airbrushed out of history, namely the petite bourgeoisie, because of these family. And these pictures are from archives, family archives of individuals. So the way I pose it is we all know what happened to Tsar Nicholas and his wife Alexandra and their children, but what do we know about the proprietor of a provincial hair salon or the provincial veterinarian, the quintessential bourgeoisie, right? And these are the people who are, in my account, the proto-Soviet middle class. So I actually chart 3 pathways into the Soviet middle class, linking the educated layers of Tsarist society to Soviet служащие, or the white collar employees and middle class. And these are pictures kind of personifying the different individuals whose lives and biographies I trace. One is on the left, a museum worker and a very prominent archaeologist. Another is a girl who was born in 1900, and when the revolution broke up, she was just finishing the private elite fee-paying gymnasium, right? So she just had a high school education. She was only 17 years old. But these are the people who were born at the right time and in the right place. And then you have medics, like this gentleman on the right, Professor Kawecki, who was from I believe Polish noble, dynasty. But he was a very prominent medic, and he retained his professional status. after the revolution. So let's look at some descriptive statistics which further corroborate my argument about how the nobility, the clergy, the Mishani merchant urban groups, and these three educated estates, how they transitioned into the Soviet middle class. So we see that the nobility, and here I have statistics for those who live in urban and rural areas, 90% in 1917 of nobles were literate. They're just literacy figures. I also have figures on schooling, etc. Then we have the clergy. Clergy actually was even more educated than the nobles. But we know that the nobility and clergy were a tiny percent of the population, right? 1.5 and less than 1, so no more than 3%. So yes, they contributed to the Soviet educated workforce, but they were a tiny slice of society. And the urban estate is quite large. It's about 10 to 12%. And we see that even these groups were more educated than the peasants, so 64% as a whole for 32% of the peasant estates. So when the Bolsheviks come to power and they have to fulfill their fantastic proclamations about building a new industrial society, they were forced to rely on these educated groups because peasants were in their mass, poorly educated and or illiterate. So what evidence do we have that decades into the Soviet period, these patterns were still reproducing themselves? Well, there was the infamous Stalin census. Some of you will be familiar with it, of 1937, infamous because Stalin kind of in good faith, really maybe because the Bolsheviks thought that they were indeed succeeding in building a brand new society where all the social divisions of the past were abolished, they in good faith administered its census using the best traditions of imperial statistical expertise, using the best statisticians. But the census revealed things that made Stalin aghast, namely that a very big chunk of society remained illiterate. Approximately 14% of all men and almost 34% of women over the age of 9 were illiterate. Women aged 40 to 44, among these close to 50% were illiterate. And 83% of those in their 60s were illiterate. So vast slices of the population that remained illiterate. Look at statistics for higher education, right? I mentioned the private secondary schools. Let's not forget that in the Imperial Russia, as in Europe at the time, having high school education was considered a big deal, right? Now so many people have college education, but we're looking at that period. But in 1937, in Russia, in the Soviet Union, only 4.3% of the population completed high school. So if you want a reasonably educated workforce, you have to rely on somebody with at least a high school diploma. And we see that people were, a large chunk of society remained poorly educated. How do we know about this census? It was actually stashed away, but historians found some of the statistical tables from it in an archive in the 1990s. So then Stalin held another census, and these census takers were repressed. I promised I will come back to the professional roots of these individuals whose images you saw on one of the previous images. And I actually create, hopefully, I contribute something to sociology by discussing 3 possible routes or plausible routes of stylized routes to conversion from these old educated estates groups to the Soviet middle class. One is what I call the organization man. What I discovered, if you look at the image on the right, let's take a medical hospital, right? What I discovered is the Bolsheviks simply incorporated these professional institutions as, as a whole. And not only that, they retain the professional hierarchies and the individuals who work them. And oftentimes, if you have a medical consultant, it will be somebody like that Kavetsky guy you saw in one of the images, of noble pedigree, highly educated, best education in imperial academies. But if you have a nurse, medical nurse, often of peasant origin, so the same individuals from these same social groups, kind of even the professional hierarchy was reproduced within organizations. Then we have what I call the museum society. After the revolution, so many of the old nobles and merchants who were hounded by the Bolsheviks, they congregated in obscure art galleries, museums, libraries, especially in the provincial setting. They actually escaped to these, where they basically reproduced their networks. And they survived that way until after the dark chapters of witch hunts, Stalinist witch hunts. But they were, basically they retained their social, educational, and cultural capital. Right, they were essentially a self-reproducing, tightly knit group, and they passed it on to their children and grandchildren. But then you had people like that, Olenka Konovalova, the girl we saw on a previous image, who were just finishing high school. Right, they were still barely out of adolescence. But those people were lucky because they had some education, but they were not professionals like a medical consultant would be, but they still had far more education than most Russian citizens. So they joined what I call the pop-up brigade, all those people who were done with illiteracy campaigns, going to factories and promoting culture among the masses. So they too joined the Soviet middle class, essentially as white-collar employees, and essentially becoming very privileged. What about the merchants and industrialists? Again, the Niklutin archive from the Volga merchants comes to our help because we have so many letters, and I analyzed semantically what those letters were telling us about how these wealthy merchants whose wealth was completely decimated, how were they transitioning into the Soviet middle class? What I discovered is they were obsessed with what they called sluzhba. Sluzhba is, so there's a Russian word sluzhashi. Sluzhashi means white collar employee, and the Soviets used it as a kind of to describe the layer between peasants, between the layer that is distinguished socially from peasants and proletarians. We called it prasoika. But what we see among these merchants is an obsession with education and sluzhba, which basically meant white-collar professional work. But they also kept their entrepreneurial acumen, which they used during the new economic policies in the 1920s. Then it sort of went underground, but essentially they were obsessed about education. What we also find, and that is something if there are PhD students in the audience, might be interesting for somebody who wants to pursue this kind of line of historical research further. I only did it in a kind of unsystematic way, but there's surely room for systematic data analysis there. What I found is that remittances played a very, very important role in the social survival and reproduction of these bourgeois groups. Remittances, as we know from contemporary literature on their role in either supporting democratic values or economic development in recipient countries, they're quite important. And I'm citing some studies there. And what I found was that Stalin actually allowed remittances to flow into Soviet Russia all the way up until at least the 1940s. And I've got these records and receipts of different accounts for remittances and packages. So we have this chunk of imperial bourgeois society essentially exposed, globalized, and transnationalized at the height of Stalinism. And the sums we're talking about are actually non-trivial. So there is such a thing as a historical currency converter, which came very handy for me, and which allowed me to estimate that the $30 that Konstantin Niklutin was sending to that matriarch, his mother, all the way until 1930 when she died in Soviet Samara. So maybe we're talking about monthly sums of $30. It sounds paltry, but actually using that historical converter, we see that it's more than $430 at least as of 2021 when I was doing those conversions. And so I estimated that by the time Anastasia died, the mother of Konstantin died in 1930 at the age of 85, Niklutin would have transferred her more than $26,000 in present-day monetary terms. So any Russian grandmother who is trying to survive on the state pension, and these 430 is more than the state pension in Russia now, even in Moscow, I believe, any Russian granny would be very, very privileged and lucky to receive those kinds of sums in the present day. So imagine somebody trying to survive in Stalin's Russia. So we have these non-trivial amounts, and there's also some great books by historians talking about that period and uncovering how prevalent this kind of remittances were, but how heterogeneous they were in terms of who got access to them. The vast majority of Russians did not. It's only people who were wealthy enough to emigrate to the West were able to send those remittances. So let me step back a bit and talk about why we should care about this intrinsically kind of historical material that I gathered. Well, we should care because the bourgeoisie features very prominently in classic and ongoing debates in historical political economy, in sociology and political science about its role in either in a coalitional sense or in a kind of more intertemporal sense at spurring particular citizen values like value of education or respect for property and rule of law, right? So we know that these things matter, but the assumption has been of the destruction of the old society and the bourgeoisie in communist states like Russia, and also places like China. And in my book, by the way, I have a comparative analysis of China, Hungary, and Russia as well, looking at the different the bourgeoisie before the revolutions or communist takeover in those countries. We also have new evidence of resilience, intertemporal resilience of values or social structure in a way, even after big historical shocks and calamities. The book by Gregory Clark on called The Sun Also Rises. There is, however, less emphasis on mechanisms, right? Because it's really difficult to come to grips with how exactly these values can survive the brutal leveling projects. But we also have great works by, Gregor Popelechis and Josh Tucker, for instance, who do try to model in really nice, interesting ways some of the ways in which these pre-communist legacies kind of interact with communist legacies, or indeed hampered the, or indeed kind of modified or moderated the legacies of intrinsically that we associate with communism. But the challenge remains of disentangling the old from the new bourgeois, from the new middle class. Why is this a big challenge? Because anybody who's trying to write a paper on these legacies would say, well, what about the communist project itself? Didn't it level society? Didn't it also create a middle class? Didn't the communist leaders actually educate society, elevate it from the depths of ignorance and illiteracy, create public services, etc., etc.? But the challenge remains, how do we distinguish specifically policies of communist states from these legacies of pre-communism when it comes to the middle class? So we can distinguish between the so-called old and the new middle class. And this is what I do with Alexander Liebman in our APSR paper. And we do so by gathering systematic statistical and census data spanning the three epochs, Imperial, Soviet, and post-Soviet, and we trace persistence using district level data for the entire territory of present-day Russia. We also use micro survey data, and actually that is something that was fascinating for us, is to discover when we did the survey administered by Levada, a prominent Russian pollster, that citizens, a lot of citizens still know what their revolutionary ancestors are. So you can see from these maps, on the left is the district level map for variations in the prevalence of Mishani, this kind of big educated estate of urban citizens. We see that they were distributed heterogeneously. This is from the 1897 imperial census. So one would think that the Mishani would be mostly around big urban areas in the northwest of Russia, but actually they were scattered in, a lot of them were in Siberia and the Far East, in often trading outposts and places historically that were developed centers of commerce. If you look at the map on the right, this is data for nobility. And we see that also, again, contrary to what we might think, in the Far East, the densely shaded areas densely, we see a bit of red. That is also where you have, in proportion to population, a significant percentage of citizens were nobles, and not just in Northwest Russia, but also we see in Siberia and the Far East. And at the bottom, I'm showing images of Mishani on the left. Just visually, you can see that these are people who are not terribly wealthy. Look at this is from a 1920s personal family archive of a family of Mishani in Samara. In the background, you see kind of ramshackle houses, but look at the hairstyle of the ladies, right? Not exactly your peasant Russian women. They're trying to be fashionable. These are the people who are transitioning from the peasant status into the kind of urban world of very different values, aspirations, and even kind of the way people look and dress is quite different from the peasant society. On the right, this is an image of Polish nobility, of which there were many. And this story of these personal nobles in Samara illustrates why so many ended up in kind of faraway reaches of the Russian Empire. Tens of thousands of Poles were sent to and settled in Siberia, for instance, in the context of Tsarist repressions against Polish rebellions. Many of them became professionals, engineers, doctors, and this is a family of from somebody who's, these are ancestors of somebody who is now a professor in Samara, as indeed these Mishani are ancestors of another professor in Samara. So these people have, and their descendants have done very well for themselves in a professional sense. One of the arguments and critiques one gets when one tries to establish the kind of resilience of social structure through the dark decades of communism is, what about population resettlements? Weren't a lot of people sent to the gulags? Weren't a lot of people deported? One way of kind of questioning or nuancing these narratives is to look at individual family biographies and to see how much population mobility there actually was. So the opportunity presented to me, again, quite unexpectedly, when I was sent a whole load of student essays. Students and high school pupils wrote historical essays about their family background. So I had dozens of those, if not hundreds of those essays that my colleagues in Samara and I actually analyzed and systematically created a data set, which we helped us make this map of population movements of these families in Soviet and pre-Soviet Samara to the present. And we see that in the middle, you see there's a kind of clump, which basically shows that most people who did move within families were moving within the Volga region or within the immediate kind of Samara region. There was population movement, there was labor migration, but not as much as we think. And then on the other hand, we see these kind of arrows going to the Far East, showing that yes, people were repressed, and yes, on their arrows pointing left, people who were servicemen moved to western parts of the Soviet Union, as during Second World War, also a lot of movement to Central Asia, again, either because they were repressed or for other reasons, but the big chunk of people actually stayed within their native region or within the immediate kind of nearby regions or immediate surroundings. And this again helps us trace this intertemporal persistence in the social structure, social texture, and values that we can attach to a given place. So this is an image from the APSR paper with Alexandra, where we specifically looked at the Mishani estate. This is based on data analysis using district level data that we assembled, and we were trying to illustrate what the mechanisms are for our findings about how the Mishani estate in particular is significantly associated with democratic outcomes in Russian regions in the 1990s, right? It becomes very difficult towards the second and third and, Putin's rule when Russia became a consolidated autocracy. But certainly for the 1990s, we see the persistence of this Mishani effect. And the causal mechanism is that we have a combination of human capital, that is, they are more educated than the peasant mass, and their entrepreneurial values, which allow us to link them to long-term outcomes. And how did these legacies survive through the Soviet period? Well, it's a combination of bottom-up and top-up factors. Bottom-up is we have these values, right, that people reproduce in spite of Soviet repressions, but we also have the Soviet planners in a top-down fashion, actually leveraging the skills, the expertise of these better educated groups. And so we link this to post-Soviet outcomes. I see there is a hand.
Yes, Diaz, go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Tomila. I just wanted to say that there was also a huge outmigration to other countries if you're trying to link the Mishani incidents to political outcomes in post-Soviet Russia. So how do you deal with that?
So if you're talking about outmigration
Like to Germany,
after
to US, to Israel.
After the revolution or after the communism collapse?
After collapse of communism, because you're trying to link Mishani state to political outcomes in post-Soviet Russia, right? Mm-hmm. So yes, that would be
absolutely. This is a very valid point, and I would say that now in the last year, obviously, we have an even more. We have this factor of outmigration of highly educated individuals, outflow from Russia, certainly exacerbated. What is kind of slightly different in my analysis from other accounts is that I specifically have the case study and data for the provincial bourgeoisie, right? We're not talking about the crème de la crème of Soviet intelligence. We're not talking about the kind of the people even who are running TV Rain now, right? There are a lot of people who were like provincial medics, educators, even school teachers, right? So we're talking about probabilistic patterns of, of a chunk of the imperial bourgeoisie that were not decimated, that were not privileged or wealthy enough to escape after the revolution, or certainly they're not, a lot of these people, and I certainly know from the example of these Mishani and noble families in Samara that they're still there, although some of their younger generation, actually this professor in Samara, I think his son is somewhere in California in the tech industry. So certainly we have this kind of intergenerational, but these are the people who can, but you're right, there is that process. But if you look in probabilistic sense, we still see that, we can't say that everybody was destroyed or disappeared or emigrated, outmigrated.
So Tomila, can I follow up? So could you explain us sort of the mechanism as to why exactly the presence of this surviving bourgeoisie from the Tsarist days would lead to more democracy and more media freedom? Like, in what sense? Should we think about it just mechanically, like Barrington Moore, that no bourgeoisie, no democracy? I'm sorry, or is there some other mechanism that you have in mind?
That's a great question. Thank you, Arturo. So I've thought a lot about this, and in my book, and especially, since the book came out and I'm kind of making a lot of presentations about it, I'm very, very careful about not saying that this bourgeoisie, these Mishani, were, that we are observing links with democracy, between the presence of these groups and democracy, because they have democratic values. So I try to make it not a story about values per se, but a story about autonomy and ability to create kind of regional pluralism and kind of autonomy from the state, which is very important, and I'll come back to that. In light of these new findings we have, for instance, by Brian Rosenfeld, and we know, you probably know of a book on the autocratic middle class, that what makes for an autocratic middle class are state dependencies, right? These descendants of the imperial bourgeoisie very nicely inserted themselves into quasi-autonomous occupations, even in the communist period. What are those quasi-autonomous occupations? We all know that, especially in the Soviet Union, there were no arenas independent from the state. Everything was essentially public, whether we talk about there was no private enterprise or hardly any. So these quasi-autonomous occupations are medicine, for instance, where, or academia, and even think tanks. I was just reading a biography of Andrei Sakharov, the Nobel Peace winner and prominent scientist who worked on the hydrogen bomb in the Soviet Union. And he talked about how they were kind of cocooned in some secret laboratory, but they were basically free to talk about political issues, including Stalinist repressions. All the people around in his circle or most of them were privileged members with Tsarist educated roots, including Sakharov himself, who came from a very, very distinguished Tsarist educated family. They inserted themselves into professions where they had a reasonable degree of autonomy. And the same applies now in Putin's autocracy. The people who are able to somehow challenge the regime are not people who, like in Bryn Rosenfeld's work, who are in these public sector jobs as teachers or these or clerks in the police forces. These are state-dependent jobs. The people who are challenging autocracy are in trendy outlets like TV Rain. Whether they're doing that from at home or abroad is another story. And also, they are actually able to escape because they are the kind of the more privileged layers of society. So I don't know if that answers your question, but certainly I see it from the point of view of autonomy that allows individuals to challenge the state. And also we see that now with the process of challenges to the war against Ukraine. Who are the people openly challenged? It's people who are professionals in elite, high status professions. So, and also same applies to entrepreneurship. This is another mechanism that we identify with Alexander Liebman, is that being a private entrepreneur gives you some insulation from the state. Although of course in Russia, we know that you can still be significantly harassed. And it's the people with Mishani entrepreneurial backgrounds who often, with greater facility, were able to join these the private sector in the post-communist period. So this is sort of the story I'm trying to tell. Although of course it's extremely difficult, as you can imagine, with linking all these different periods.
Yeah, Diaz has another question.
Yeah, sorry. Could you please repeat again what occupations in USSR have an autonomy and what kind of autonomy is that? Because I just didn't get what autonomy they had in USSR. Yes,
so if you read memoirs by dissidents in the Soviet period, right? We're talking about the 1960s, the emergence of the dissident movement, late 1960s, 1970s. And if we look at the profile, for instance, of dissidents, right? So we know that in the Soviet Union, just like now in Russia, only a tiny handful of people were brave enough to, like in 1968, we had 8 people who came out to protest against the war and the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. There were only 8 people. If you look at the biographies of those people, which I did, you can Google them up there on Wikipedia. Pretty much everybody comes from extremely privileged backgrounds with a very strong presence of scientists, especially people in the STEM subjects. So the sciences, and there's a reason for that. And again, I talk about that in the book. Even in the Gulag, there was a social hierarchy whereby scientists, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn describes it in his in one of his novels, The Sharashki. There were these kind of scientific laboratories in the Gulag where scientists were reasonably privileged. And I say privileged in quotation marks because we're talking about the Gulag. But they were doing white-collar scientific research, whereas people with no scientific skills like they had, they were doing breakback work, laying rail tracks with primitive tools. And this is the story of human capital that allowed people, especially in the sciences, and also a lot of the people self-selected themselves into the sciences or into things like Oriental studies and foreign language learning, because these are areas that were insulated from ideology, right? If you wanted to become a historian in the Soviet Union, everything you wrote about would be impregnated with ideology. So if you don't want to do that, you become either a scientist or do some esoteric stuff like Sanskrit studies, you know, or ancient Greece, or which free of ideology. So there are those kinds of different mechanisms for how people ended up in the quasi-autonomous domains of professional work.
So, but Tomila, can I follow up on this? So are you saying that in addition to them being in what you call privileged background at the time when they create this autonomy, or when they dissent against the state, right? Or are you also saying that they can trace that privilege back to the Tsarist days? In other words, was Sakharov an offspring of a Meshchani family? Like, is that what you're saying?
So sorry, I didn't hear the last. What was the?
Yeah. So for example, so I understand. Okay, Sakharov, by virtue of him being a renowned scientist, had the privilege to speak against the regime to the degree that few other people could. Right. I understand that.
Yeah.
But my understanding of your thesis is that this would be also an example of a person who traced that privileged background back to the Tsarist days. So in other words, was Sakharov's family during Tsarist days a Meshchani family? Is that the type of argument you're making? Or is it just that Sakharov during the time when he was a dissident was also a scientist? Like, these are two different things, right?
Sure. So Sakharov's family, they were not Meshchani, but they are a classic example of the broader educated estates, whom I kind of conceptualize as the bulk of the contributors to the Soviet educated middle class. So they were, in Sakharov's case, clergy and jurists, so legal profession, trained. A lot of his ancestors on maternal and paternal sides trained in imperial gymnasia, which were we've heard about them. You know, by the way, gymnasium is a very important institution for providing really brilliant education to these individuals, who then converted their high human capital. And they were a tiny minority of Russian imperial citizens with that kind of human capital. They were able to convert it into high social status already in the early post-revolutionary years by becoming scientists. So Sakharov's father was a physicist, who was a high-profile physicist already in the 1920s and 1930s, and also he played the piano. And Sakharov, he inherited the human capital of his father and his other ancestors, all extremely highly educated. What those people also did, and I describe it in my book, they avoided the Soviet school. Sakharov's education, as indeed that of his cousins and other people in his social network, it was quite typical of these educated people. They avoided the Soviet school by doing home tutoring, because they were so loath of their children being brainwashed by the Soviet school, and they didn't think much of the quality of the Soviet school either. So they avoided indoctrination as well. That is also one element of the story. All these are kind of bits and pieces of information. Of course, I cannot capture with statistical analysis, but they complement the story I'm saying. But my story is really about human capital, how it allows people to become more autonomous professionals, and how that autonomy helps shelter individuals from the pressures of supporting an autocracy. So that is the kind of causal story I'm trying to say. On Meshchani, similar arguments also apply to Meshchani, except Meshchani were not as privileged as people of like Sakharov family, who were really high status elite. A lot of the Meshchani were of modest means, but still superbly educated compared to the vast majority of imperial Russian citizens. And they became, like that girl, Olenka on one of the pictures, they became teachers or medics already in the 1920s. But there's an intergenerational kind of growth there as well, because their children then and grandchildren become university professors. So the story of social mobility is not static. So while these Meshchani are becoming university professors, the peasants are just either trapped in collective farms or some of them managed to escape into the city, but to join the factory labor. So this is the story of social movement I'm talking about.
So Ivan has a question. Just Tomila, just to heads up, you have about 13 minutes left altogether. So please have it in mind. Ivan has a question.
Yes, is there any understanding whether political views of members of the new middle class or middle classes really differ from the political views of the descendants of old middle class of Mishani?
So I think the political views, and again, I'm careful not to talk about values per se, but it's really the story of education. And here, maybe it's a good time to bring this graph, which Alexander produced, which illustrates the difference between the old and the new middle class, or this story that we're trying to say. So if you look on the left graph, this is unfortunately regional rather than district data, so we have fewer observations, only because we have this press freedom index for 1999 for the regional level only in Russia, which is Russia has 80 odd regions. And if you look at this statistic for share of workforce for university degree, around that same time, this is post-communist data, and how it correlates with press freedom index, we see that it's not a very powerful kind of, it's not a very good predictor. And actually, by speaking to sociologists who have used higher education statistics for Russia, they say that, well, they always struggle with this statistic because usually it's a good measure of middle class, right? How, establishing individual middle class belonging, but in Russia and how it relates to democratic outcomes, but we see it's quite imperfect. But then if you look on the image on the right and you have the same press freedom index with the share of Mishani from the 1897 census, and we see that it's a more powerful predictor. And so we think it's because Mishani kind of captures things like entrepreneurial capital, which allows people to to be autonomous from the state, and so in regional media pluralism, also to run independent news outlets, etc., kind of to create a more pluralist society, civil society. But it's also about human capital, and we know that the better educated individuals are, the more they are supportive of democratic values, except that Soviet and Russian educational statistics are often quite meaningless because they don't really capture the kind of human capital that is intergenerationally reproduced and is not easily captured with statistics of university attendance. And in Russia, we know a lot of the people, there was a lot of corruption also in the educational sector, especially in provincial settings where a lot of degrees are bought and sold. So this is the story of the new and old middle class, which is also kind of nicely captured by Anatoly Vishnevsky, a Russian sociologist and demographer, who writes about how these so-called middle class groups who live in urban areas, they're actually in a large proportion of them are latter-day peasants. And he writes that by 1990, urbanization in the USSR reached 66%, but among those aged 60, only 15 to 17% had been born in the city. Only 37% of the population were native urbanites. So basically, on the eve of Soviet collapse, we have these large, respectable levels of urbanization, but these people who live in the cities, a lot of them are latter-day people, peasants who are escaping the collective farm, with all the implications for, their human capital and, or perhaps even values. And although I'm very careful to talk about values, about, what do they think about rule of law and things like that, if they've not had experience with rule of law, if we think about serfdom, etc., and all those deep historical legacy. So Vishnevsky writes that Soviet citizens in their majority remained urbanites in the first generation, and they bore the stamp of transient status marginality And this stamp will be inherited by their children. This is a very, very important point. And if we look at, and here I link my work with that of Bryn Rosenfeld on autocratic middle class, because Bryn talks about those public sector employees. And I trace how a lot of the peasants from collective farms, for them, it's a great social uplift to join the police forces and become like clerk in some local police station. That's a respectable white collar job for somebody who's escaping the collective farm. So these are a lot of these autocratic middle class people that Bryn talks about. We can trace where their origins are from. They don't become, these are not the scientists of the kind of Sakharov social profile. So just to quickly recap where I see my contribution to the wider literature. As we know, there's a big historical turn in the social sciences with really exciting, really interesting work going on across the various subfields, and my book hopefully contributes to those debates. But I also take historiography seriously. Not all works in historical political economy or historical sociology actually work with primary historical sources. I've tapped into archives and archival sources, and I actually, that allows me to delve into a bit of historiography as well. And also I try to broaden the dialogue interdisciplinarily, in an interdisciplinary way between sociology, political science, historical political economy, and history. And finally, let me just wrap up by saying that with the war, Russia's war against Ukraine, I've really been thinking very hard about how my book, which by the way came out before the war, the invasion of February 22, how my work actually helps us understand Russian society. And I see that when I hear news about those Russian men from deprived rural communities going to fight in the war, it very much speaks to the findings of my book, which is really about the deep entrenched nature of social divisions in Russia and the deep inequalities that are not easily captured with kind of material indices alone. This is the story of precarity, right? When I hear about Russian village folks going willingly to fight in the war for a couple of $100, this is because historically they were marginalized and live in extremely poor communities. On the other hand, we have a tiny minority of the population who are openly challenging the autocracy, but that's not very different from the communist period where the dissident movement was very small, or the Tsarist period where the intelligentsia was a tiny percentage of society. So taking a more historical approach to social divisions rather than the kind of survey statistics on education or things that capture present day social division, I think would get us more further to really explain and getting to the bottom of social divisions and something that fuels support for the war on autocracy and indeed helps challenge it. I see Josh has got his hand up.
Right, so who are the people on the left in the context of the argument you just gave us?
So in a very
young urban people supporting Putin.
So it's a very stylized, of course, picture and argument, but I would say the bulk would be the rural folk who are bused, or people from small deprived towns who are bused to these events, were paid. And now we're hearing there will be a big event in Russia, in Moscow, that's timed to the first anniversary of the invasion, and people are being paid 500 rubles, which is, as we know, is a pittance, but presumably that gets some people to get off their backside and participate in these events. So a lot of them are rural folks or precarious folks who are bused to these events with the promise of material inducements. A lot of them are public sector employees, whether they support the war or not. They're pressured, they work in kind of low paid budget sectors. I don't think a lot of them would be university professors or individuals running prestigious medical clinics or media. We know that in a lot of the media, the opposition media like TV Rain, certainly they won't be there. And then I also have an image with these people with police batons. I think that's a really interesting story. And again, those of you who are PhD students still trying to decide what your topic of your research should be, I think that's a very interesting sociological story for us. Who are the people? What kind of social backgrounds are these people who beat up protesters and who joined the tens of thousands in the police forces? Where do they come from in a kind of sociological sense? Like, are they members of the working class? Are they kind of latter-day village folk? What kind of family values do they have? Like, I would be interested, although I'm a political scientist, I think it's a sociological story, though, that helps us answer these big political science questions about repression in autocracies. So it's not just about institution of the police forces and coercive institutions, but to me, it's also a sociological story about social divisions. So to answer your question, I don't really know, Josh, the good answer. And I think this is for the next generation of kind of researchers to really kind of unpack those things for us a bit more. But tentatively, this is how I would answer this question. And you're welcome to disagree. I'd be very happy to hear somebody has a better answer to that.
No, I'll open it up to questions now.
So we have a question from Bruce Allen, Comero.
Yes, thank you. Fascinating presentation. So you describe a lot of this group as having essentially imperial heritage or aristocratic heritage. What percentage of this group is Jewish? And were they discriminated against in a different way than bourgeois, those who were not Jewish who had, a bourgeois class? So I'd be interested in knowing, again, what percentage would be Jewish, pre-Soviet and post-Soviet, and then were they subject to different kinds of discrimination? Thank you.
That's a really, really good question. So fortunately, I think I do have an answer. So in the APSR paper, we obviously had to cover all our bases very, very carefully. So we run regressions, and you will find them in the appendix, showing that even when we control for the shares of Jewish population, as indeed old believers and Protestants, we ran lots of different regressions, we still find that this effect of Mishani especially, and more broadly educated estates holds. But in my book, I'm also on one of the very first pages, I say that the story of Mishani is not irrelevant to this question of the ethnicity and religion are not irrelevant to the story about Mishani for the following reason. We all know about the discrimination of different minority communities like the Jews that forced them into particular occupations, right? Or forced them to reside in particular parts of the Russian Empire, right? And so same with Protestant communities of, for instance, the Volga Germans, many were Catholics as well, many became professionals. And so, and a lot of the people self-selected themselves into, living in particular areas or becoming even urban citizens, right? Because they wanted to escape the rural world. And so this kind of self-selection mechanism was there as well. And in the immediate post-revolutionary years, we do find that a lot of the Mishani in provincial towns like Samara, for instance, in those prestigious schools, they were Jewish, and they also were rapidly transitioning from a kind of small trader occupations into professional occupations in a modern sense. So being an artisan, for instance, or a shoemaker, was a kind of one step in the pathway for the next generation to be able to afford to send your child to that fee-paying gymnasium, and for the child to become a medical doctor. So in my book, I talk about this Greenberg dynasty of medics, elite medics in Samara, and how they were venerated in the city, despite all the witch hunts against the bourgeoisie, because they had that human capital and they were established medical professions. But yes, the story of the Jewish community is very important. But also, it's to me, it's a story of the wider question of descent. Where does that origin? That's actually in the next book I'm working on. This merchant family of the Constantine inclusion, they were actually old believers. And old believers in some of the, I forget whether it's Weber or some of the sociologists have likened them to the Jews and the kind of quasi-pariah status that encourages people to either join particular trades or occupations or to just have a different mindset from the prevailing communities around you, in this case, the Russian Orthodox communities. So there are all these different historical mechanisms that not all of them are easy to track with statistical data, although some, like we do have very rich census data that allows us to get statistics for different religious and ethnic communities, including the Jews.
Thank you very much, Tomila. Let's everyone clap, give a virtual clap to Tomila for this very nice presentation and discussion. I also would urge and recommend all of you to go now to Amazon.com and order 2 copies of Tomila's book, one for yourself, one for your loved ones. And on that note, I'll see you all, well, some of you next week in 217 when we go back to physical presentations. Thank you very much again, Tomila.
Thank you very much, and for the great questions. I really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you for hosting me.